So yes, so as you know, we're going to be talking about water, especially in the context of the urban scenario. So, right. So obviously, most of our urban areas have, the standard water bodies. You'll have lakes, ponds. You may have temple tanks or, associated with such institutions and things. And of course, we have groundwater, which is a very important source in most urban areas, and rainwater, right? So these are broadly water sources that everyone's familiar with living in a city. It's true for most parts of the country anyhow. So what I want to talk about today is also how we approach water in the urban context. How do we look at it? Why do we look at it the way we look at it? And what does that mean? Okay, in the way we use that resource, the way we share or don't share that resource, and where do we want to go from here? Is this an acceptable mode of access and use, or do we need to change that? And if so, how do we change it? Why should we change it? And so on. So I think you'd agree that at least definitely in the urban areas, we all tend to view water as some sort of fundamental right to have it anytime and every time we want it, right? Most people in urban areas will say, I open a tap, the water should come. We've lost that thing maybe 2 generations back where we filled water and we stored it and we used it carefully and we didn't expect 24/7 water supply. Now we do. Piped water has made us sort of lazy in that we expect that water to come all the time, right? And if it doesn't, we all know who to blame. So that's one aspect of how we look at water. And we don't have any understanding or interest in conservation, in the fact that this is a limited resource which needs to be shared. It's how much ever I want, I will use, and nobody can question that, right? So that's one of our typical way that most people approach water. And nobody can question what I use it for, right? If I want to wash my car twice a day, that's my right. It doesn't matter if somebody else doesn't have water to drink. So that's the kind of thing that we approach this with. And in an urban setting, we tend to outsource any of the tougher questions of managing that water better, conserving it better to someone else, typically the government. It's the government's job to figure it out, how much water is there, but to make sure I get all the water that I want. So I think in your recap, you raised this thing of want is not the same as need. So that's part of how we approach water, that there should be enough water for what I wanted, not necessarily, it's not connected to how much I need. So why do you think we have this approach to water? Any ideas? It's not like we've had this idea forever and ever, right? Somewhere in the past, hopefully we were a little better at it. But because I think we have been disconnected from the community. Okay, yeah, we don't see where the water comes from. We have no clue. It's just this abstract thing. There is water and it comes in a pipe. Yeah, it's like so. As a kid, I remember having grown up in a city. A lot of your things that get supplied to you, you don't see where it comes from, right? And there's this story in my family about how my brother went to the village, to our ancestral village, and came running and told my parents, Amma, the milk comes from cows here. Because he'd never seen a cow getting milked, and you get it in plastic packets in the city. So that disconnect. You have no clue, you don't see the larger picture, you don't see where the resource is coming from, you don't understand the dynamics of it. It's just been delivered to your doorstep and you use it. So that's basically where you're at. So before we get into that, so typically, it's also the way our laws are structured, it's connected to that. So if you look at pre-colonial times, for example, you would find that the way we managed our water, so I don't want to say, golden past kind of, everything was beautiful in the past and our ancestors did an awesome job of everything. But you tended to have more decentralized systems. It was a mixed bag. Definitely there was centralization. You had rulers laying down the law on what you could do or what you could not do. But to some extent, some decision making was allowed to come down to the local level. There was some management of resources. People looked at what they needed at the local level. So the local river or pond or lake or whatever would be managed locally, typically. But of course, you can't forget that there were all sorts of other issues tied with that. There would have been, who had the power, who had the money. So your caste hierarchies would have come into play. So there were definitely inequalities and issues around those as well. But to some extent, it was decentralized, somewhat. So there's always a caveat in these things. Okay, and obviously we did not have the kind of urban centers that we do now, with the kind of pressures that we do now. So definitely it was no doubt easier to share these resources in a better fashion back then. But then when you look at the colonial era, you will find a lot of our, even a lot of our current day legislation is connected to these colonial era legislation. It's impacted, flavored by, and in many cases just taken word by word from those acts. These acts still hold good. They've not been repealed. So these come from a time and space when they had a completely different understanding of water, when their knowledge was very different. They did not understand the interconnectedness of groundwater and surface water and so on and so forth. Plus, their perspectives were totally different. So typically more about revenue, about management, about resource use, but not necessarily about equity, and definitely not an ecological approach, which is something we are waking up to now. So if you look at these acts, which these essentially link, like the Easement Act, for example, links your water rights to your land rights. So if you own the land or had some right on the land, the water below it was yours, largely. Okay, I'm making a bit of a generalization here, but it linked. If you had rights over the land, you had rights over the water below. So which is ridiculous in many senses, because the groundwater it's not compartmentalized. The land that I own, it doesn't have a chunk of water which is cut off from water elsewhere, right? It's all interconnected. So to have those kind of rights, and it begs the question, of course, of what about people with no land, who are landless? What about them? What rights do they have? So, and these laws also sort of divided what the central government could do and had rights over, what they could legislate on or what they could control, versus what the states could influence and do. So the Canal and Drainage Act, for example, it recognizes the government's right to control the use of water in all natural courses, rivers, canals, lakes, all of that for public purpose. Okay, so, and then over time it was extended to control of all surface water. Okay, so essentially it gives government complete control of all your surface water, which basically then alienates all of us. You're leaving it in the government's hand to decide everything for you. You have no agency in this. If you look at in India today, how we legislate on water. So you guys know, right? Union list, state list, concurrent list, all of that, right? So entry 17 of the state list is where water is. Okay. So this is irrigation, canals, drainage, embankments, water storage, water power. All of these are in 17, but subject to entry 56, okay, which is on regulation of river valleys and interstate waters. So you have all these larger projects, right? River valleys and power, when they do hydroelectric power and all of that. So that comes under this. So under this entry 56, you also have some option to control and regulate how interstate rivers are managed and watershed. So you have something called the River Boards Act, which is supposed to manage this and manage disputes and so on, but it's been fairly non-functional. Right, and then under Article 262, essentially it gives the Parliament the powers to pass legislation on disputes, okay, regarding water on interstate rivers or river valleys, okay. And it also allows the center to have a lot of power over large irrigation projects, really large hydropower projects, flood control, multi-purpose projects, okay. So all of this is vested with the center. They get to make a whole bunch of decisions on this. So as you can see, a lot of this is about building huge concrete structures, which they like a lot of, okay. Other than that, if you look at how we approach water, it's largely sectoral, like irrigation. It's set into these predefined things. You're looking at it as either use or something like PWD developing a bunch of structures for you. So it's all piecemeal. There's no holistic nature to this. They don't look at how all of this is interconnected, okay? So you will approach it in these little different silos, and you will look at it as if you've got all the water for that, and you're going, all the water in the country is available for irrigation, available for drinking, available for hydroelectric, available for, industrial use. You never actually see in total how each of these interconnect and when and how you're using this, and what about uses which are non-extractive like fishing. So where do they fit in? What are their rights? None of this comes into play. You just look at it in these individual little piecemeal things, okay? So for example, if you, even though in more recent years we've had like the National Water Policy, the most recent edition of it in 2012, which prioritizes what you can use water for. So drinking is one of the top things, followed by irrigation, agriculture, and domestic, and then I think pretty much at the bottom of the list is industrial use, but from most experience it tends to be the other way around. We don't necessarily follow that hierarchy that we think should be followed. Okay, so the other kinds of legislation which impact water are a bunch of other things which look at water as a part of a larger picture. It's only a small part. These are acts which talk about conservation of water in different ways, because under the Fisheries Act or the Wildlife Protection Act, it recognizes that water is an important component and a lot of wildlife require water and all of that. But it's only one small part of it, and it doesn't actually connect holistically, and none of it looks at how we're using the resource and how that can be sustainable and managed in a long-term space. We actually don't have a Groundwater Act for the country, which is amazing considering we use so much of the groundwater. They did put out a model bill, and some states have developed their own groundwater acts, but largely we don't have a system to regulate groundwater in this country. My state had an act, and then they repealed it. And we're still sitting and waiting for a new act to come into place to manage groundwater. And even what existed back then was all about how much water you can extract and what is the licensing process for that, and how much do you pay, who's the authority in charge. None of it is about who gets to access, how is it equitable, how is it sustainable. None of those come into play at all. So, and yes, it's definitely political. For example, I don't know if you saw in the news, I think a month or so ago, we had a tanker strike in Chennai for about 2 days. Essentially because the government tried to pass a couple of notifications to regulate groundwater extraction. They were trying to put caps on how many tanker loads they could remove and from where. Okay, and it's a very strong lobby, and they went on strike, and the government had to back down. Because right now the city, will come to that, but the city fundamentally has a huge chunk of its water coming from groundwater outside the city. So we are tapping peri-urban and agricultural areas, tapping their groundwater and sucking it up for the city. So those kind of things, if you're not going to have some system which controls it, then it's only going to escalate and get worse and worse. And I'll give you some example from Chennai itself, since that's where I know best. What the path that we've set ourselves down as a city, and why that throws up a lot of questions on how we're managing these resources. But yes, definitely it's political. Unfortunately, as with most things, it's political. I think if you'd remove that component, we might have some things easier as well in this country in some ways. So we've also, a lot of our legislation has also been influenced by the courts, right? Our Supreme Court has been known for some suo moto interests in various subjects and taking it upon themselves to go forth and give comment on various things. But interestingly, even the courts have gone this way and that way on this issue of water. So the first case up there basically says the state has sovereign right over water. So all water in the commons, even where you have customary systems and norms in place, the state has sovereign rights. So that's in 2004, not so far back. Okay. Whereas the other two, the MC Mehta case is a famous one, which was one of the early ones to bring in this concept of the doctrine of public trust, right? Which says that all common resources are held by the state in trust for us citizens, that they have no ownership rights over it. They're only custodians for the greater common good. And that does not just mean this generation, but also future generations. So it is their job to be custodians, to manage and help us handle that resource for the future as well, right? And the 2011 judgment on commons, have you seen that one, right? Familiar with it? A very interesting one came out of Punjab, where there was encroachment on a water body. And this was a water body with some common land around it, which was used for various purposes by the village. And a bunch of people had encroached upon it. And in the judgment, it reaffirmed this idea of the doctrine of public trust and called for the state to remove those encroachments, saying that these are definitely things which need to be preserved, which are commons, which are there for the greater good and belongs to everybody. You cannot divide that up. So in a commons, I have rights over the entire common as much as you have rights over the entire common. I cannot say that I have a 1/5 right and I can take away that part of the resource. We all have a common interest and a common right, and therefore a common duty to manage that resource together. If you look at the Kaveri Delta, there's been a lot of research. So even way back 20, 30 years ago, there's been research to show that between the rain and the water that we get in the Kaveri, the delta can manage largely. There is no need for this fight. But like you said, it's been politically motivated over the years, and it's become an issue, and now neither side can back down, because to back down is to lose political face, and that is a large problem. So it just ends up being, why don't you do something, and you're stealing my water, kind of an issue. But that's the whole problem with the way we're looking at this resource, right? We're not looking at it as a commons, where you have equal rights, I have equal rights, and how do we share it? And even then, we're only looking at humans. We're tending not to look at other life forms, which really have as much right over that water as we do, right? We do not want to recognize any of the fish or any of the other species in that river, which is why we dam the rivers and then let everything else die in that river. So, the only way we know how to deal with the water is to say there is so much water flowing through it, and therefore this is your percentage, and you can use that, and I will use that, and you extract it. But for some reason, we've always in this country had this thing that urban areas get to use up as much resources as they want, right? and you're allowed to suck resources out of the rest of the country. Right? Look at electricity. For the longest time in Tamil Nadu, Chennai would not have power cuts or would have very nominal power cuts, whereas the rest of the state would go on 8-hour blackouts. How is that fair? Why should the city get that priority? Are we doing something so much better or more important than the rest of the state? So it's the same concept. We think it's okay for the cities to guzzle all of these resources with no limits placed on it. And by the city, we tend to mean only some part of the city, because there is obviously, I think you guys have already been discussing for the last couple of days, that there is a huge variation in access and how equitably that distribution and access of resources is within the city. And then there's city and rural. So there are levels and levels of discrimination that we are continuing to keep up with. Right? And these river disputes are just that. We think it's okay for us to suck all that water out. Your first use of water should be at the local level, and in the case of these rivers, potentially irrigation, because ultimately it feeds us as well, not just people living and growing those crops. And then, so their drinking water needs, their irrigation needs, and then not to forget, how much ecological minimum flow you need in that river to keep that river alive and healthy. And only after all of that is met, should we even consider piping that out to elsewhere. And in that case, it should not be too far away ideally. You don't want to be transporting it hundreds of kilometers away to another city. So ideally, yes. But this is how we've set up our systems with our big dams and, idea of storage and managing that water and moving it from place A to place B, because, we're playing God essentially in how we use those resources. We're privatizing beaches in a big way. A lot of beaches are being sold to resorts, which then have a private beach. So there's a huge access issue coming up there, right? So last month I was in one resort like that, and though people claim that the beach, you can access the beach, you can't, not unless you're staying at the resort and you're a guest at the resort. So then what does that mean for the fishing community over there? What does that mean to any random person who just wants to walk and sit on the beach? Why should they be kicked off that space? So all of that, right? Why are we building thermal power plants on a common land, on a beach, on the coast? Is that what we want with that space? Is that okay? What does that mean for that space, and what does that mean for us? What is the impact of that? None of which we are considering. But the doctrine of public trust requires the state to look at all of this before it takes these decisions. But like I said, it's not embedded in our law. So it's a concept which we have sort of, we believe in, or at least in the Constitution to some extent, and then the Supreme Court has affirmed its belief in that. But we tend to forget about it whenever it's inconvenient. So there have been, even like I said, the Supreme Court going backwards and forwards on this concept of what is the common space and whether the state has what rights it has over it, whether it has ownership rights or it's just, being a custodian, a guardian of those spaces for us. So I think we'll all agree that most of our urban water commons are in a bad way, largely. I doubt if we have any city in this country which has a really clean waterway, right? I know Hussain Sagar here is pretty bad, right? It's extremely polluted. So all cities have this problem. Bangalore's lakes are in a bad way. It has a river, which I never knew, and I go to Bangalore 4 times a year, and I have family there, and I know a lot of people. And only recently I discovered, talking to someone in Atri, that they have a river. I was like, really? Where? So yeah, so all of our urban waters are polluted. They're encroached upon. Many have disappeared. They do not have water flowing through them. They tend to have more of sewage and garbage not flowing through them. And as a result, you have a whole bunch of other problems which arise. One is health, of course. Excellent place to get diseases. They're just not pretty and they don't smell nice, so nobody wants to spend any time there. So you're losing that aesthetic value, that open space, recreational space, or whatever you want to call it. And because we're not taking care of these bodies, we have other issues of flooding. We have water scarcity anyway in our cities. And because we're not taking care of our water bodies, it's only making that situation that much worse. So, and largely, what has all our response been? Our government, so the public tends to say the government needs to do something. That's typically our response as citizens. Blame the government. The government is not doing this, the government is not doing that. There is no responsibility with us as individuals or as a community. And what is the government's response? They are focused largely on technological solutions. Can I bring in more pipes, bringing in more water? So what we just discussed a couple of minutes ago, but bringing water from faraway regions, from tapping rivers in other states, and now interlinking rivers. So presumably, in a few years, sitting in Chennai, I might get water from the Ganga. Is their brilliant plan to solve this whole issue, right? So privatization. I think you guys had some discussion about this privatization of water supply. Some cities have already started in some states experimenting with this, putting meters and having private supply of water. Our tankers themselves are private supply of water, so we already have had that for a long time. And then every now and then we decide, oh, we need to do something about our water bodies, and we decide to clean them up, typically before the monsoon. And our cleaning is essentially bring a JCB and dig. And wait for the rains to fill the water body again, and wait for the garbage to come back again. And then when you get the next allocation of money in the budget, go through this process again after 4 years or 5 years. So, or if like in Chennai, you have a flood, immediately after the flood, you beat yourself up and you go through this process of cleaning and then fall back into your old bad habits. So, talking of Chennai, we've been a water scarce city forever and ever. And all my life, I grew up in that city, and water has always been a huge thing, and we've always discussed how we don't have water. It's one of those conversations that you have throughout the year. Will we survive this summer? Will the monsoon be adequate? How are we going to survive this? How are we going to manage? Are we getting water from elsewhere? So on and so forth. But we actually have a lot of water bodies. We have 3 rivers, and we have several canals which connect these rivers, which are built in the British time. Many of them, the Buckingham was built way, way back. In fact, it comes all the way into Andhra, quite a far bit into Andhra, that canal. Surprisingly, a couple of years ago, I went for a talk by someone who tried to track the canal all the way up. And it goes several, a good 1,000 kilometers into Andhra and connects water bodies along the way. So that was built largely for transportation of goods. But now it's mostly not navigable, it's in a bad state. If you go outside the city, it's marginally better, of course, but within the city, it's synonymous with the sewage canal, just like the rivers. In fact, the Kuam, to anybody who grew up in Chennai, the Kuam means sewage. It's become another word almost, It's a derogatory kind of, you could use that in those ways, the way you use that word. So we have, and we have a lot of lakes, or we had, with several thousands of lakes, okay? There are areas, so down the road from where my office is, for example, is a road called Tank Bund Road, and there is no tank. So obviously at some point there was a tank. So we filled up a lot of these lakes and water bodies. So these are not lakes, many of them were actually just shallow, low-lying areas, which were partially deepened and used by people earlier to store water. So they're called eries in Tamil, and many of them have been filled in. There are large parts of the city which you can identify as actually having been a lake by the name. Okay, so there are places called Velacheri, which is an entire locality which is heavily built and has come up in the last 20-25 years. The word eri tells you that it was a lake at one point. And there is an eri still there, but it's highly reduced because the rest of it has been encroached upon. Right? And then we have this wetland marsh complex called Pallikarnai, which interconnects, it used to be interconnected with a lot of the eries and with the canal. So that's how the water flowed from one eri to another as the overflow happened. And a lot of it is also in the catchment area of some of the rivers, of the Adiyar and the Kosataliyar and the Pool. So you would have water movement traditionally as the monsoons came in, the lakes get bigger, water flows from one lake into another, and it's like a cascade series, and some of it connects with the river as well, right? And that's how the water found its path and had a system. But we've made sure that we've cut off all of that by building on it. Okay. So instead what we've done, we've switched to piped water to large parts of the city. Obviously, not everyone has access to piped water. So this comes from several of the reservoirs. We have Pundi, Red Hills, we have 3 to 4 reservoirs and a couple of the lakes which are used to access for drinking water. And that's not to say that those waters are necessarily clean. So the quality of water is a huge issue as well. And then groundwater, which as I said is not regulated at all. Pretty much everybody has a bore well. If you have a house and you have land, you have a bore well, right? And tankers. So the government itself provides tankers, which are not too expensive. Other than that, you can also, there's a huge nexus of private tanker suppliers who bring water to the city from peri-urban areas. They go out and strike a deal with farmers outside, tap their groundwater and bring them back for the city. So this has been an ongoing thing for the last couple of decades at least, for sure. And in the last 5-10 years, we've had a lot of talk about desalination, and now we have 2 desalination plants which are functional and supplying the city. Okay? Minjur and Nemmeli desalination plants, and I believe there's talk of a 3rd one coming up at some point. So these are of course capital intensive, right? They are also problematic environmentally because we don't know what impact that's, how it's going to change the local salinity of the ocean in that area. 2, we've already seen problems relating to erosion with the desalination plants. So Nemmeli, even before it was fully functional a couple of years ago when I went by with some other people, we saw that the land, the coast immediately to the north of the desalination plant had been completely eroded. Like you have the coast like this and then suddenly it would just cut inwards and the whole scoop of land has been taken out. And this is a problem with the East Coast which everybody knows about and has known about for now at least 15-20 years. But we continue to do this. And when you build a hard engineering structure on the East Coast, you will have erosion to the north of it and accretion of soil to the south of it. That's how we have our iconic Marina Beach in Chennai. It was not as wide as it used to be. There are photos which show how much smaller it was way back in the 60s. And now it's become this wedge-shaped. It's broad at the north and then tapers to the south. Because we have the port, Chennai port, with these walls which stick out into the ocean. And so when so this is a phenomenon which has been studied and understood now that the wave action changes through the year. So for about half a year, you have waves bringing in, the tides and the waves bringing in soil this way, and the other half it brings it in this way on the coast, right? And generally, so there's constant erosion and accretion of soil, but over time it tends to even out. But when you build something which blocks that movement, then you're in trouble. And that's what's happening. So now this side you get a pileup of sand, and that side you get erosion. Because this movement has been blocked, so on the northern side, there is no possibility for accretion of soil. So every hard engineering structure on the eastern coast will have this problem. So now we're seeing it with the desalination plants. We've seen it with the port, we've seen it in Pondicherry, and now instead of doing something about it, they're building what are called groins, which are these little walls of boulders which stick out into the ocean at points to bring in more soil. But then it just moves the problem further north. Every time you build a little wall which sticks out, there's a pileup of sand on this side and erosion. So then you build another wall there, so there's a pileup of sand and erosion. So essentially we're pushing it to Andhra, and Andhra can handle the problem. So, and then someday they'll push it to Orissa, I suppose. We'll work our way around the coast and come back. But that's basically one of the issues that the desalination plant has brought about. And that the immediate impact is, of course, on the fishing communities living there, because they have no place to park their boats. The way they access the ocean, the beach is also a very important part of all of their daily activities, for drying, for net mending, for a whole bunch of community things that they do. And you're essentially taking away all of that because you want water to drink, because you can't be bothered to do the more painstaking work, which is to manage your water bodies better. So instead, we're building these desalination plants for the city. And I don't know how many of those fishing communities get that piped water, so whether they're actually getting any benefit out of the desalination plant itself would be a question. There might be some communities which get, but potentially not all. So, right? And now the city, so the corporation wants to expand. It's got some grand plan. The city is about 1,000-something square kilometers, and they are looking at an 8-fold expansion to 8,000 plus in one notification. They started the process. There's been a lot of protest and discussion, so it's still ongoing. It's not been finalized. But essentially, we will eat up part of all the neighboring districts. So all the problems that we piled on these areas, we will now extend that further, because all the water we're stealing from what is now peri-urban areas, those guys will get opened up to development and expansion and become part of the city. And that all the problems they face, they will push as well to people further out. So this is, that expansion is not necessarily only to do with water. It's a larger development thing. We're still trying to understand why they want to go down that road and how it makes anything better. There's been a lot of talk about this, saying that we haven't, see, even I say you. So the government and the people have not been able to manage the current city properly, right? We don't know how to access our resources equitably. We've not made sure that urban space is a good space for everyone. Then why do we think increasing the city 8 times is going to make anything better? So back to water. Every 3 to 4 years, Chennai has a really bad year. The monsoons will fail. We would have tapped very badly into our groundwater. We'd start getting desperate, and that's when all these agreements with neighboring states to supply water from rivers far, far away will start popping up, and all of this will happen. Okay. So saltwater intrusion is another huge problem which has been talked about a lot in the last 10, 15 years. Being coastal, this is a huge issue for our aquifers. But yet we continue to build on our water bodies. We have not learned. The 2015 floods have not taught us anything. The 2005 floods didn't teach us anything. They were not as dramatic as the 2015 one. We didn't get national coverage like that, but it was still pretty bad for some people. And yet we've not learned. And yet we continue to build on our water bodies. We continue to encroach. And we continue to regularize those encroachments. So some quite some years ago, CAG, the organization I work with, filed a PIL saying that we need to do something about all these encroachments, coastal, on the water bodies, everywhere. All these illegal constructions need to be curbed. And instead, the government said what was supposed to be a one-time regularization process where people could step forward and say, yeah, I'm sorry, I built illegally. And then you were regularized and therefore you became legal, and that was that. And then they did it again. And I think again, at least 2 or 3 times now. So you're actually incentivizing this ridiculous behavior. So we continue to do these kind of things because again of the political push, of the huge lobbies, and then there's also the fact that some of these encroachments are actually the urban poor. And this is because the government dumped them there. So when we had construction for the overhead train, the local suburban line was built on top of a canal, on top of the Buckingham Canal. And that being in a very bad shape, obviously the people living on the banks of the canal were poor people, right? Typical, right? So they're already in this horrible space. And they were picked up from there because they wanted to build these stations and train lines and whatnot. Picked up from there and chucked outside the city into the Palikarnai marsh. So they became encroachers all over again. They were encroachers on government land within the city, and then they got chucked outside the city into the marshland. And so now they are encroaching there. So now then there is also a vote bank issue. The government cannot push them out of there, right? You've already set them up there, and now if you push them out of there, where are you going to put them? They're already on the edges of the city, and then you're going to push them even further out. So the government itself does not see it, will not do this now because it becomes a huge problem. That first shift itself was highly contested. So not only are they encroachers, they're also in a horrible space in terms of living in the middle of a marsh, right? With little to no amenities. Plus, every time there's a bit of rain, all the garbage comes into their house. So they're living in, extremely healthy, lovely situations in slum tenement construction. Plus, Palikarnai is where all the city's solid waste is dumped, a large part of it. We actually dump our garbage inside the marsh. If you look at Google Earth over a period of time over the last 10-15 years, you'll see this growing mass in the middle of Palikarnai. It's nothing but the garbage. It's been steadily being dumped into the marshland. So that's basically what we're doing with our urban water commons, and that's how people, marginalized communities are getting also doubly hit and triply hit by this. So as I said, instead of having a solid waste management plan and, looking at how to change this scenario, we're continuing to do these piped water from far away, desalination plants, all of these kind of solutions. This is what is seen as the future option for the city, right? We did get a chunk of central funding to clean the city's waterways. And they started a couple of projects on that, which are still ongoing. But while maybe like a kilometer or 2 has been cleaned, and the water is nicer in that part, it's connected to the rest of the river, so it's never going to be truly clean unless you clean the entire river. But the larger problem with the area that they've cleaned is that it's also now out of bounds for most people. So it's supposed to be a park. So when I say out of bounds, it doesn't mean that you can't access it. It's just that it's become an eco park. And so there's a wall around it, and there's an entry time. I think it's free entry from what I know. But there are entry timings. There's a process for that. I think they try to limit the number of people who access per day to keep the place better. But then it throws up those fundamental questions of who is going to then actually go and access that space, right? It's quite intimidating, I'm sure, for some people to try and access that space, even if they know that it exists. So I have not seen or heard of too much footfall in that place now. Okay. So that's just one tiny part of one water body, of one river that they've done. And they're looking to extend this cleaning process to the rest of the river. And part of that project, their grand idea is to have, like on the Thames, you have sidewalk pedestrianized shops and whatnot and spaces. So they want to have roads on either side with recreational space. So again, this does not take into account access rights, who gets to use this, whether this is the kind of usage that people will find useful. Is it going to change things for fishing communities who use this river? What about all the slums which live on the side of the river? What are you going to do with them? Are you going to chuck them out? What is your idea for them? And there has been constant efforts to move communities like that away from these water bodies. One of the communities that CAG works with says that every now and then people try to come and check. And there's a lot of talk of eviction, and I think some parts of that community are already getting evicted, and they're right on the banks of the river, of the Adyar. Similarly, communities at the mouth of the river have for a long, long time fought what they feel is the initial stages to getting evicted, which is to do a census of them. So post-tsunami, this was one big thing. I was working with the CSC at that point, and I was talking to those communities, and they said that they were really nervous of new people coming in. So the minute you step in there, there's like some 20 people who come in, like, who are you, what do you want, right? So then once they decided that I was not going to be doing something shady, they said, so I said, why are you so, I understand that obviously any new person, is going to raise a flag, but why are you having such a reaction? It's quite extreme. And their thing was that we've had several people from government agencies try to come in to take a census, and we feel it's because they're trying to kick us out of here. And apparently there was a lot of talk as well, saying that what if another tsunami comes? You're right, in the line of fire if a tsunami comes, and you should move. So this was the kind of arguments given to get them to move to those marshlands that I was telling you about. And just a few years before, other communities had been moved to the marshland for these development projects, right? And once they get moved out, what's going to come? High-rises, gated communities, whatever. Because that's prime real estate, no matter whatever you say and do. All your talk about tsunamis is just that. It's ultimately, you're going to have huge amounts of development on that space. So when we talk about how the waters are polluted, why this is such a problem, typically everybody's reaction again is to point at these communities. They are polluting. Look at them, letting their sewage out. They're taking a crap right on the banks of the river. But honestly, about 300, 400 people in one slum versus all the high-rise apartments along the river body. Are you telling me that all of these buildings of middle-class and upper-middle-class people, hitting their toilet flush 5 times a day, are letting out less sewage than that one community or two communities, right? And to be honest, there is no guarantee that all of our waste is getting treated, right? Our STPs are overloaded. Mostly they're just like a conduit. You keep it there and then you dump it back into the water body untreated. So there's actually no clear idea of how much of our waste is untreated and dumped into the river versus how much is treated and dumped. And even if it's treated, what kind of treatment are we doing? Is it adequate? What does that impact have? So, but the easy answer is to always blame, the economically marginalized, the poor, push them to the side, say they are the problem, throw them out. And this is something you will see even with activists who believe in cleaning the river and restoring the river. So this is one of the huge questions for me on how we want to take forward, how we are, managing our water bodies. But anyway, so going back, so I was jumping ahead a bit, but so going back to these schemes to clean, essentially they're looking at, like I said, bringing a JCB, digging, pulling out all the sludge. So the idea is you deepen the water body so it can hold more water, increase the water retention capacity of the water body. What you do with the sludge, nobody knows, right? So I attended, so that Hyderabad again, the Hyderabad connection. So they had hired some consultants out of Hyderabad to look at how to clean up the Buckingham Canal, and those guys were saying, we'll desilt. What will you do with the silt? We'll spread it out, dry it out, and all the organic stuff will be mulched and reused somewhere. But the point is that how you'll do it, where you'll have the space to do it, nobody knows. Plus, a lot of that muck which comes out will largely be plastic. So what are we going to do with that plastic? We haven't figured that out. It will go back into Pallikarnai, which is connected to the Buckingham Canal. So ultimately, it's all going to come back here. Plus, how are you going to stop new waste coming in to that water body after you clean it? Okay. So now, in the last year and a half, not even a year and a half, just about 8 months to a year, they woke up to the fact that the monsoons will be coming again. And since the flood is only 2 years old, it's still there in people's memories. They woke up to the fact that they need to do something. What if we have another heavy rainfall? So they've called on companies or anybody, in fact, even NGOs or anybody who feels they can do this, to adopt a water body in the city and clean it and restore it, and then hand it back to the corporation. Okay. So, but basically this is the same thing. You desilt, pull out all the muck, deepen it, shore up the sides, and wait for the rain to fill it up. Okay. So these are largely what they're looking at. Plus, like in Bangalore, which has already tried these beautification projects, we know. I think Hebbal Lake was one classic example where they wanted to have walkways and turn it into a mini park with lights, and so all the middle class people can do their jogging, walking exercises, and it's gated and locked and shut down for the rest of the day. So again, that kind of plan in certain places, they want to have beautification and boating and those kind of activities. Whether there are people using that for grazing or fishing or other kinds of activities, it's not considered, and whether those activities then are activities that you don't want to have in an urban space is the question. Why is that unacceptable, or you don't consider that as part of being in the urban commons? Okay, so then what exactly do we want then? So one, for us at least, I would imagine we do need some legislation, and this legislation by itself is never going to solve anything, but we need some legislation. So we had rainwater harvesting mandated in 2005, which is a good move. It made a difference for a couple of years. Our water improved. People felt overall it was better. Again, obviously, it's still only people who have access to that groundwater, to bore wells. But there was no follow through in how it was implemented and enforced. So we need something which pushes people to do better rainwater harvesting and to recharge their groundwater, and also to regulate how much groundwater we access per house, per family, per person, whatever, right? We also need to reconnect all our waterways. We've lost a lot of the connections. We need to figure that out, reconnect our waterways, understand which way the water flows, allow for that when we do our planning, okay? So there's some examples from other parts of the world. So Netherlands, it seems, in some of the cities, because they are actually below sea level in certain points, right? So traditionally, they built all these dikes, those walls, which are supposed to protect them. So instead, now they're also looking at how to open up space along their water bodies and not have any hard use over there, no structures, no huge buildings and stuff. Leave it open and make it an urban common where you might have some activity, but nothing which will change the nature of that space, nothing which will require you to put in infrastructure. And when it rains or when there's floods, the water has a place to go. So that would be something which would make a lot of sense for a city like ours. But whether we're willing to take that extreme step and work towards it, because that's going to take a long time. A lot of the construction on our water bodies and on the edges are already, well-connected people and so on and so forth. The government itself has encroached on water bodies, built educational institutes and such like on them. So how we could even do this would be a huge question. The other connected thing is how we manage our sanitation. Right? There's huge inequalities in sanitation, obviously, and even the ones which are connected to a network are not treated, they're dumped somewhere. So how do we reduce the amount of sewage we produce? How do we manage the sewage produced better? So there are some examples of, there's one of the petrochemical utilities in Chennai which has been buying sewage from the government and treating it and reusing it in its facility. So this was a few years ago. I don't know how much they're doing still now. So it's a great way for the state. You're selling your sewage, making money off sewage. You don't have to treat it. Okay? So it's reducing your load. It's a win-win for them. And for the company, it's, you're going to get some supply of water. You don't have to be dependent on tankers and other very erratic sources because there's always going to be sewage. So at least some part of your water requirements, and it apparently worked out much cheaper to treat it and reuse it. Okay. And another very interesting example is several of you from Calcutta, right? The East Calcutta wetlands traditionally has this thing of sewage fisheries and sewage agriculture. So that's always something that potentially cities could use because that's a low input, low cost sort of way of managing sewage. For example, if there's a high level of chemical and antibiotic inflow coming in and stuff like that, then you need to, it's not that you can just do it you can't just open the tap and let it run. You would definitely need to have some systems in place. But it's one potential way of dealing with some part of your sewage again, not all of your sewage.
Maybe the kitchen water.
Kitchen water. Actually, kitchen water is problematic because you have detergents. A lot of our water is problematic because of those soaps, detergents, those kind of chemicals are problematic. So that's what I'm saying. So you may actually need to do some amount of treatment and then let it out. It would depend on the kind of treatment, what that would cost, how complicated that gets. But it's one potential way of dealing with some part of your sewage. Okay. Actually, they tend to use your raw sewage, fecal matter, because that's your high organic load. And that's what the fish and the other things can use. That's what gets dumped. But of course, now our cities are more complex. The sewage that goes out is more complex. It's not so simple because you do have other things. And in many cities, you have industrial effluents as well getting mixed in there. So it's not as simple as letting it out somewhere and letting things do its natural course, right? But you could explore that as a potential solution, partial, one possibility. You may decide that for that city, it's just a very bad idea for whatever reason, that it's not viable. But it's one potential option to keep in mind. Yeah. Right now, we're anyway letting it into the water body. We're not doing anything. And the organic the load on our water bodies is ridiculous. It's an insane level. I don't think I've seen fish in our rivers for a long, long time. Yeah, you need to know the composition of what you're throwing out there. So it's not as simple as just letting it out. You would definitely need to have a system which would track all of that. But it's potentially one way to manage your sewage. It would also, because it would also impact the quality of your agriculture, right? Because those vegetables or fruit may have high content of certain minerals or elements that you don't want. So you'd have to have something in place for all of that. But it's one way that you could potentially consider, right? As with anything, there's a lot of ifs and buts and things that you would have to set up in place before you do it. And ultimately, I think a large part of, this morning at breakfast we were discussing whether people actually know that these issues exist, and people do know that there are problems. They just don't want to, deal with it. Right now, water's coming in my pipe. I'm cool. That's all I care about. Tomorrow, if no water comes, then I will raise a fuss, make a noise. So, but we don't push our government to do what is best for us. So what is our role? What are we doing as individuals, as a collective, as a community? What are we demanding of our government? Instead of demanding 24/7 water, are we demanding that they're transparent, accountable? Are we demanding that they ensure there's equity in the way they give us, in the way we use these resources? Are we pushing them for any of that, right? With groundwater, for example, the state tracks groundwater levels in different parts of the city. And that data, at least for Chennai, is sort of uploaded somewhere on the website. But it's like a monthly average by district, which is just ridiculous because that doesn't tell me anything. So that data, that information needs to be available. I need to understand it. I need to use that to improve the situation in my place, right? So that level of transparency and accountability is not there. That information is not readily available. If I go today to the city government, they're not going to share that information with me. So we also need to push the state on some of these things of how they share information or don't share information, right? And then, like I said, what are we doing? In this country, we just like to blame everything on the government, right? We like to blame somebody else. It doesn't matter who. I'm happy to blame you. Happy to blame somebody sitting somewhere. But what are we doing? Are we ensuring rainwater harvesting is properly done? Are we pushing other people we know to do it? Are we doing water audits and conserving water? Are we understanding how much water the slum down the road is getting? Are we looking at what are the issues there? When it comes to restoration of water bodies, what is our take on it? What are we doing? Are we pitching in? So there's been some experiments, for example, in Bangalore. And even in Chennai, there are communities which are trying to do this to restore water bodies. But it is a very difficult task. But then all good things tend to be tougher, right? So when you say you want it to be fair and participatory, and we use all of these words which we know we have to tick off and we want in there, those are the toughest things. Within this room, you'll have 20 opinions on one thing, right? So imagine extending that to a whole bunch of other people who come from completely different perspectives and backgrounds than you. So how do we find a common meeting point? What do we agree on? How do we agree on that? It's a huge, huge task, right? Which is why it's a very, very slow process. I think in Bangalore, some 4 lakes or 5 lakes communities have managed. And how many lakes do they have? It's going to take forever. And doing it once is not a guarantee that this is going to sustain over a period of time. 4 months down the line, if people disband and don't continue with that work, you're going to slide back. So how are we going to beat all of these and take up our responsibilities as citizens to push this forward? Okay. But I mean, like I said, as always, there are people doing in small bits and pieces, trying out little pilots. But sometimes I feel like we're eternally in this phase of pilots. We're all piloting little projects, and it never seems scalable. You have architects doing green architecture. You have people working to make communities self-sufficient with their water use, all of these things. But scale it up, bring it to different communities, different perspectives, really, really tough. So I think that's something that we need to really work on and see how we want to move that forward. If we want to make our cities equitable in terms of all kinds of resources, but in this context, water, and also sustainable for the long term. And not just for humans, right? We tend to forget that there's a whole bunch of other creatures which depend on those resources. So how equitable and fair are we being to them? Thank you.